Hello and welcome back, everybody. I hope that you're enjoying your summer. First things first, hopefully you've received all my emails from the past week, and in case you haven't, here's a quick breakdown of their contents. First off, I've sent off a link for the study that you need to participate in. Do yourself a favor, get over to do it right now. Then it won't sneak up on you at the last possible second, and I promise you that the thing doesn't take too long either. I also informed everyone that I'm having some trouble updating the syllabus for some reason. I've received a few questions concerning due dates, and I've tried to clarify that in the syllabus, but for some reason, every time I upload a new document, it reverts back to the old version of the syllabus. It's been very frustrating. I don't know what to do about it. So just to be totally clear about things, discussion questions will generally be due on Friday by midnight. Same with the quizzes. Thus far, you should have 2 discussions posted, and this week will be your third. So if you're behind, this is basically your last chance to catch up. Now, I said generally, and the reason I said generally is because I'm late this week, and I'm very, very sorry about that. I'd like it if you guys could try to have your discussions and quizzes done on time by Friday. If it's possible for you to do that, then that's great. That would be optimal. However, if you aren't able to make it by then, I won't hold it against you, of course. Just get them in when you can. Try to do it before, we have classes again next week. But, late submissions I'm not going to penalize when I was the one who screwed up this week. This is the first time, basically, that anyone has tried adding a video component to this online class. Otherwise, it's always just been, here, read this massive amount of material, and then take our tests. And I didn't like that. So I'm trying to, incorporate this video component. I had a sick little girl over the weekend, and I just misjudged the amount of time it would take for me to put together everything for this video. So I do apologize truly, and hopefully this won't happen again. Next. I wanted to let you guys know I'm going to be in Japan for a few weeks coming up here, which will make me a lot more difficult to get a hold of because I'll be on the opposite side of the planet. You might have to wait a considerable amount of time more for me to respond to emails, but we'll still be able to do the class. Everything should work out just fine. Finally, we're going to be talking about diffusion of innovations today. It's not adequately covered in your book, so I've uploaded a reading to D2L that you'll need to take a look at for this week's quiz. Don't forget that the quizzes make their return this week as well. We had a week off from them last week in order to accommodate that survey. All right, that should be all the procedural stuff, so let's go for it. Now, diffusion of innovations is a very useful theory. It's one of those theories that even if you aren't planning on remaining in the communication field or being a communication scholar, that you're going to want to keep it in your mind because it allows you to predict some things that maybe normally you wouldn't be able to predict. And it's a very well-tested, well-heeled theory. Now, the idea behind diffusion of innovations, basically, the definition really, is it's the process by which an innovation is communicated through certain channels over time among the members of a social system. So, in other words, it's how ideas, information, and inventions spread throughout groups of people, okay? That group of people could be a state, it could be a country, it could be the world, it could be amongst nerds, it could be amongst professional sports players, whatever population it is that you're looking at. And innovations spread in a very predictable way through these groups. Now, let's define innovations here, too, because usually when we talk about innovations, we're talking about, inventions and that sort of thing. And it's definitely included in that. Innovations are ideas, practices, or objects that are perceived as new by an individual or other units of adoption, right? You could have states be a unit of adoption, right? So anyway, yeah, that's how that theory breaks down in a nutshell right there for the definitions. Now it seems like these would be very difficult things to chart, but actually, in fact, when we break it out into some separate components, it becomes very easy to quantify and measure. The four fundamental elements to diffusion of innovation would be innovation, the innovation itself, right, the new idea. Then communication. So that's what channels is this idea moving through, or is this information moving through, or is this invention moving through, right? How is it that people are becoming exposed to it? The social system. So that's who are the different actors tied to, right? I have a group of friends, and I think on like Facebook right now, I think I've got like 220 friends, and they're all people who I would in fact consider friends in real life as well. Uh, so those would be a social system of mine, right? And some of them are very weak ties, right? Some of them are people where if I see them on the street, I probably will recognize them, but I haven't seen them for years, and so, they're friends from tradition, more or less. Um, so some of those are weak ties. Some of them are very strong ties, right? Like my family or lifelong friends, and maybe more information flows through those channels. And then, of course, there's time, right? Because it takes time for this sort of thing to happen. If I have an idea, I need to mull on that idea for a while and make it into something that's presentable, and then maybe it moves to somebody, and then they go through the same process and they pass it on to somebody. So time is a very crucial element for diffusion of innovations as well. Now, when you take all of these factors into account, what you end up with is this way of charting something that moves in a very predictable way. And what we call it is the S-curve. So here's an image of it right here. And this is how innovations move through societies, right? The x-axis here is time, and the y-axis is the percentage of the population which has adopted the innovation. You can see some characteristics to the S-curve, right? It starts off slowly, and then all of a sudden there's this very rapid takeoff, and then the S-curve slows down and stabilizes. So you can think about it like this, right? An idea starts in one place with one person, right? Or an invention starts at one place. And over time, that individual is able to convince other people to adopt this innovation. Now, there's that many more voices that are speaking for that innovation, right? So when one person convinces three, then now there's four total, and then maybe each of those three convince three more, and now the growth rate becomes exponential. So this means that you can actually quite accurately predict how an idea is going to move through a large social system. This is how innovations penetrate societies. Now, if they're communication-oriented innovations, they tend to penetrate a little bit faster, but that S-curve is always going to be an identifiable feature to it. Now, there have been 5 factors identified as being important to innovation. When an individual rather is confronted with something that is brand new, they're going to weigh these factors in making a determination as to whether or not they are going to adopt an innovation. The first factor is called relative advantage. Relative advantage just asks the question, how much better is this new thing than the thing it's replacing? If an innovation isn't really a notable improvement over what you're already doing, you're not very likely to adopt it. Something that's new has to be better. Now, with media, this can actually be very hard to discern, right? Anytime you've got a new form of media, it always resembles the media form that it's replacing, right? If you look at really old movies, they looked like theater. Old TV looked like film. Right now, virtual reality stuff looks like normal video games, just kind of set in a sort of 3D. It takes some time to explore the implications of a new medium. Now, if there's nothing there, then the medium's probably going to die out. But if there is something there, it'll eventually come into its own. The second part of the puzzle here is compatibility. So that would ask, how well does this new thing fit into my life? Is it something that I can actually bring into my life and use? Right now, I'm working on a very cool project here at MSU, which is going to be about as close as you can get to a holodeck in this current day and age. Now, for those of you who don't know, a holodeck is like those things in Star Trek that you can walk in and it creates a live virtual environment for you, basically. We're working on doing something that's not unlike that. Now, obviously, I would love to have a holodeck in my house. That would be incredible. But there are some problems. For one, it's absolutely huge, right? So I would need to get rid of both of my children in order to make space for a holodeck in my house. The other thing is it's tremendously expensive, so I'd need to get rid of both my children to afford it. Because it wouldn't fit very well into my life, it's got very low compatibility. So I might want it, and it might offer a big relative advantage over what existed before, but it's not affordable by me. I don't have space in my home. I don't have the ability to make that space in my home, so I'm not going to get one, right? Next factor would be complexity. That's how difficult is this new thing to learn and understand. One of the reasons that the older generations were the last to adopt computers was because they'd never used one before, and they're really not intuitive devices. A computer requires specialized knowledge. Just to make a purchase decision, right? You have to know what you're buying and what do they mean when they're talking about an i5 or an i3. These numbers wouldn't even make sense to somebody who didn't know what we were already talking about. They require specialized knowledge to assemble, right? And you have to know what plugs into what and where. It requires specialized knowledge to operate. There are these arcane symbols all over my screen right now, and somehow I've managed to figure out over a lifetime of using computers what all of them mean. But if I was looking at this for the very first time, when I jump onto a Mac, which I am not very familiar with, it is a pain to be able to do anything that with a PC I'm able to do in a few seconds. So all this specialized knowledge is required. If you're unfamiliar with the entire process, it would be an absolute nightmare to try to use a computer. They're high complexity, and so older people who didn't have to use them didn't use them. The fourth factor is called trialability. This one is whether or not an individual has an opportunity to give this new thing a test run, to be able to play with it a little bit before making any sort of commitment to it. I've often wondered how people get a job like lion tamer, right? It kind of seems to me like the very first time you try doing it, you're either going to successfully become a lion tamer or you're going to be a lion's supper, right? How does somebody even know whether or not they're going to be good at it? It's a job that's got ridiculously low trialability because your trial is whether or not you're going to live. So we like to try things before we commit to them, right? Even just with buying things, right? The more expensive the thing is, the less I'm going to be inclined to buy it off of the internet. The more I'm going to want to be able to try it in advance. That's why there are certain things that still don't sell well on the internet, right? Like couches. We want a chance to actually try something like that before we buy it to see if we like it. So then the last factor is called observability. Observability is, have I seen other people using these new things? Can I see other people using this new thing? iPods were absolutely genius. This probably predates most of you guys. The product itself wasn't really all that genius, right? It wasn't even a huge step up from what we already had. The relative advantage was actually pretty low. But they made it so that it would be very, very easy to see other people using them. At the time, headphones were all over-the-ear headphones, and they were all black, right? I guess that's what I'm wearing right now, right? But that's how everything looked absolutely everywhere. Then all of a sudden, Apple comes out, and instead of these big over-the-ear headphones, they've got these little earbuds that you stick into your ears, and they're not black, they're white, which was highly noticeable. So everybody out there was able to see if you were using an iPod, and because iPods were the cool new technology, that meant that you were a cool, savvy person, and they became a status symbol, effectively. Cell phones and hairstyles and even political opinions to some extent. You know, people trumpet political opinions these days. When they're widely viewable, we're more likely to adopt them. Conversely, if it's something that's adopted only in private, like, you know, specific brands of toilet paper or something, you know, that's a low observability. We're less likely to adopt it. You know, kitchenware, right? We don't know what other people have in their kitchens, and oftentimes we can't really see. That's one of the reasons, actually, that they try to amplify trialability by letting you use some of these things in the store. That makes them more saleable. So those are our 5 factors that contribute to a person's perception of whether or not they are going to adopt an innovation. All right, that takes us then to our first discussion point for this week for your video discussions. All right, so here we go. I am a big zombie survival fan. I absolutely love the genre. I think it's getting a little bit tired right now, but at the very least, I like thinking about it. When we moved into our last house, my wife looked around the house and she says, "Brian, this house would be the most zombie defensible location we've ever lived in." And I fell in love with her all over again. So I want you to suppose that the zombie apocalypse has hit, and you're in the situation of having to survive while being overrun by the Walking Dead. But you have managed to hook up with a ragtag band of scrappy survivors, and you're eking out a living in this post-apocalyptic world. Now, one day, you're out scouting for supplies, and you come across a shop that's filled with things that could be used as weapons for fighting the undead, for fighting zombies, right? But you are only going to be able to carry one weapon back with you. So here are the weapon choices that you've got. There's a chainsaw, there's a katana, there's a baseball bat, there's a crossbow with 5 bolts, and there's a double-barreled shotgun with a box of 6 shells. Now, I want you to pick one of these weapons and then justify your decision using the 5 dimensions of a successful innovation. Talk about where some of the other weapons were not as good and why they didn't make the cut for you. All right? So now we've talked about what goes into making a successful innovation. Let's talk about the process that an individual goes through when they are actually taking something that was previously unknown to them and they're bringing it into their universe. If you have any job at all that requires that you move a product, this is kind of an important, series of steps for you. The first one is knowledge, right? A person just learns about a thing. If they haven't heard about it, then nothing is going to get off the ground. You have to know first. Then there's persuasion, right? They get persuaded to try it. Now, this can be a time-consuming process of trying to persuade someone, or it can be a very quick process. It depends on the kind of commitment that would be involved in it. Decision is the next step. After you give it some thought and you give it some testing, there comes a point where you have to make a decision. Am I going to bring this new idea, bring this new invention, bring this new thought, bring this new innovation into my life, or am I not going to do it? If you do decide to do it, then you go to the 4th step, which is implementation. Right? That's when you take this new thing that you've got and you gradually figure out how it fits into your life. And then the last step is confirmation. We want other people to admire our new cool thing. We want to talk about it a little bit. We want to step back and assess the impact that it's had on our lives. Generally speaking, we have confirmation bias when we're looking at things that we've already purchased or invested time and effort into. So generally speaking, you're going to view what you've done as more positive, even if it's actually not all that positive. for me, a good one would be Netflix, right? I learned about Netflix when it was very, very young, before it had an online component, or online viewing components, actually. It's just, they were just mailing out DVDs at the time. And I was persuaded to try it because I never would get to the video store. But I'm a media scholar, so I kind of need to consume media if I want to keep that title, right? So I made a decision. Well, it's, you know, super cheap, right? It was like $8 a month, and I could watch all the DVDs I wanted. And man, I tell you what, they had quite a library. I was able to watch some hard to find things. Implementation. It took a while for me to kind of get into a rhythm of getting movies from them. And then when they had the online component, that rhythm changed, right? I don't think I've swapped out a DVD with Netflix for months. But I watch them online very routinely, and my daughter watches them online probably every day. You know, it became very much incorporated into our lives. We got rid of television because it was so completely incorporated into our lives. And then confirmation, you know, I talked about it. I told other people that I thought Netflix was really cool and a really worthwhile investment. And I would look at my own life and say, I would not have been able to watch these movies if I didn't have Netflix. And so I thought it had a positive impact on my life overall. So I went through those 5 steps for Netflix. You can probably think about that exact same thing for any new thing that you've ever brought into your life. Going to the gym, having a workout routine, having a consistent breakfast time. When your new semester started, the pacing of your classes and where you would fit in meals or socializing in between. Any new thing that enters your life goes through these stages. All right, now I'd like for you to mentally rewind to the S curve, right? I'll put it back on the screen here. Now that curve is showing the number of people who have adopted an innovation at a point in time, a percentage of the population which has adopted. We can take that curve then and we can divide it into categories. So effectively we can divide people into categories on this S-curve. Right here at the start you've got innovators. They're the first 2.5% of the S-curve. Usually you're talking about well-off nerds in this category, right? Calm guys like me if it's a media thing. Engineers very frequently will fall into this category. There's a lot of risk here because the thing that you're getting might never take off, right? It might not diffuse. People who bought video phones back in the early 90s just sat around waiting for somebody else to buy a video phone and give them a call, right? People bought Laserdisc players in the 90s, and then the medium never took off. So you're taking a gamble. But generally speaking, these are the people who are interested in the technological advance, or they have some sort of immediate benefit that they'll be able to draw from it. Then you've got the early adopters. They're typically financially well off, and they're often opinion leaders who are looked to by others for advice concerning things in this area. They make up the next 13.5%. And as you can see, this is where the curve suddenly starts to take off. Because these people here are opinion leaders and people are looking to them for advice, if this is an innovation that they approve of, this is where the thing is really going to start taking off. We get into the bulk of the people now. A full 34%, 1/3 of the overall population falls into this part, the early majority category. Typically, the early majority is upper middle class. They're a little adventurous with their purchases, but they want to know something about them first. Maybe they have some trusted critics that they look to for advice when they make a purchase. But this is where it really takes off. So if you're an investor and you're looking at investing in a product, you can feel pretty confident looking at diffusion figures, looking at sales figures, if it looks like it's about to hit this upward curve. If it looks like the opinion leaders aren't going to pick it up, then don't pick it up. If it looks like they are, this is the time where you'd really like to get in on investing in that particular innovation. Then you've got the late majority after that. That's the next third of the population. So between these two categories, we actually cover 68% of the population. The majority of people fall in here. With the late majority, they tend to be middle class or lower middle class, or they tend to be very skeptical of new things, right? Now, we're painting with a pretty broad brush here, but anybody can fall into any of these categories depending on the kind of innovation. Then last of all, right here, we've got the laggards. Laggards, for whatever reason, either fail to adopt completely, like they just reject the innovation, or they adopt it way, way, way later than everybody else. So oftentimes laggards in the category are poor, or they're worried about taking on additional debt, or maybe they're philosophical holdouts and they don't want to adopt something for some sort of ideological reason. For example, I love downhill skiing. I just took my daughter downhill skiing for the first time 2 months ago. She's 3, and she really took to it well. We went out to Park City, Utah, and I actually was able to get in there for the very last weekend of the season. So it was a good time. Anyway, more than a decade ago now, they came out with these things called parabolic skis. Parabolic skis are kind of shaped like an hourglass. Now, before that, the skis that I had had, and which everybody had, were ramrod straight. I mean, just perfectly straight skis. And I've been skiing on those my whole life. I liked them in a lot of ways because they were fast and challenging, and turning was a little bit tricky. I hated the new parabolic skis. First off, they were slower, so that kind of, I felt like, impinged on my fun. But they actually had this effect where it made turning easier. And so people who were brand new skiers who weren't very good yet were able to look a little bit better than they actually were. So I just hated these skis. Even when straight skis like mine weren't being sold anymore, I still stuck to my very long, very straight skis, and I enjoyed skiing on them. The very first time I ever skied on parabolics, and remember, these came out more than a decade ago. The very first time I ever skied on parabolics was when I was skiing with my daughter in Park City just a couple of months ago. I enjoyed skiing on them, but they are slower, and I don't know. I'm not positive that I'll actually adopt. So I was a laggard for the downhill skis because I had a philosophical objection to skiing on them. However, I've also been an innovator for other categories, right? I've got virtual reality and a GTX 1080 video card because I'm a media guy and I kind of need / want those things. So I was a laggard for this, but you could just as easily be a laggard if you couldn't afford to go skiing, or if you were scared of going skiing. Any of these things would cause you to not adopt. So let's review real quickly what we know at this point. We know that information passes through communication channels, and it can influence behaviors. It can even influence behaviors in the long term. I behave differently because of an adoption decision I made for Netflix a long time ago, right? And we know from Bandura's Bobo the Clown experiment and the resulting social cognitive theory that people learn by watching the behaviors and actions of others. So this takes us then to a rather interesting theory, and a very long-lived theory called cultivation theory. Now, this theory took off in 1967 with a guy named George Gerbner. He was part of a body of research called the Cultural Indicators Project. And the Cultural Indicators Project did a lot of interesting things. They produced a lot of stuff. You'll see it in the PowerPoint, but I don't really care to spend time talking about it all here. Cultivation was by far the most important thing to come out of that project. He found that over time, people who watched a lot of TV had their worldviews warp a little bit, so that they believed that the real world, the world not on TV, the actual world that human beings actually live in, was closer to the world portrayed on television than it actually is. So, for example, part of cultivation is called mean world syndrome. crime and violence are way overrepresented on television. People who watch lots of television, surprise, surprise, believe that the world is a much, much more violent place than it actually is. And the more TV that you watch, the more that you think that this is the case. By the way, that effect of the more that you do something, the more something else happens, that's called a linear relationship. So light viewers of TV have this only happen a little bit, moderate viewers have it more, and heavy viewers have it a lot, right? That's a linear relationship. That's just fun science knowledge there. The root of cultivation is actually in storytelling. Gerbner believed that we learn nearly everything, our information, our morality, our norms, our health information. What does it mean to be a healthy person? What does it mean to be a beautiful person? Religion. We learn it all through storytelling. And that television was the great storyteller of our age. What's really interesting, and this is kind of key, Gerbner and cultivation are highly intractable about this idea that television is the great storyteller. TV, as far as they're concerned, has not been supplanted. And he would hold that cultivation theory only applies to TV. It does not apply to internet. It does not apply to any other medium. And if you ask them, okay, well, 100 years ago, would we have been able to take cultivation theory and apply it to maybe theater or to books? He would say no. He would say that this theory only works if you're using television. And there are some reasons for him to think that. Now, anytime there is a theory, that theory requires that we make some assumptions about people or about the world or about the nature of reality even. We haven't really talked about these assumptions that we make so far, but as we progress in this class now, we're going to be talking about these a lot more, and they're important things to know, because if you don't buy the assumptions, then you might just reject the theory outright. These are things that might or might not be true. They almost border on worldviews in some instances, and if you accept them, then the theory is open to you. So cultivation theory, its assumptions would be, first off, that TV viewing is habitual. That means that nobody is a casual TV consumer. You watch it with a level of dedication, and it has a place in your normal daily routine, right? You watch it as a matter of habit, maybe without even thinking about it, right? That you turn on the television. He would also hold, cultivation rather, would hold that TV viewing is non-selective. This is pretty important because if people on average are able to choose what it is that they watch, then they control the messages that they receive, and their input is relevant. So cultivation needs for TV viewing to basically be non-selective. You watch what's on. And third, and this is the last assumption, it would also hold that the messages on television are relatively uniform. I have some trouble with this one now. In other words, if people who are heavy TV viewers have common perceptions of the world, they either almost be watching exactly the same thing, or the messages that are being communicated have to be basically identical. Now, for me, this one feels more like it would have been a lot easier to swallow back in 1967 when there were only like 3 stations on TV. But it's a little tougher now with, 17 kajillion stations on TV to believe that there's a uniform message that's being communicated. However, in some very broad categories, maybe you can still make a case that there's some, meta-narrative to television. So that's going to be part of our the second part of the discussion video right now. Do you think that TV is still the great storyteller of our age, or have we moved on to new mediums? And then the last part here, are the messages of that medium, be it TV or whatever, uniform enough that you would still expect to see linear results with heavier viewers? So we've talked about cultivation, and we've talked about what it says and what it might do, and we've talked about the assumptions that you have to have going into it. And frankly, even though the assumptions seem sweeping at first, they maybe aren't bad assumptions. And if you don't buy those assumptions, you still have to contend with the data, which are pretty strong for cultivation theory. So if people watch a lot of TV and they believe that the world is a lot like the TV world as a result, uh, what kind of world do they believe we live in? What is the TV world like, and how does it differ from the actual real world? Well, it differs in a lot of ways, as you might imagine. The way that we're going to take a look at today is in terms of stereotyping. And this can kind of be an uncomfortable topic to talk about because it involves that we breach topics of race and sexuality and that sort of thing. And this is not the last time in this class that we're going to have to breach these topics. So I'll just warn you in advance that we have some touchy issues to talk about. But we're scientists. We're looking at media. These are things that are relevant and present in media, and we really do need to understand them. These are the things that people are actually concerned about. So being able to give good information as opposed to the huge amounts of BS that we constantly see out there, even huge amounts of BS oftentimes pawned off as science. We really need to be able to pay attention to these things. So let's start off with talking about stereotyping. Now, first off, and I'd like to get this out of the way, stereotyping is not inherently bad. We need stereotyping. We need to be able to make decisions based off of heuristics. Heuristics are like mental shortcuts that we employ to make quick decisions when we don't have the time or the energy to dedicate our brains to fully contemplating a topic, which is pretty much all the time, right? We employ heuristics like when we say something like, I don't want to eat at that restaurant, it looks sketchy, or that guy seemed nice, but there was something creepy about him, right? We base a lot of thought and decision off of stereotypes, right? Off of our heuristics. Now, if we didn't have our heuristics, then you would never survive a trip through the cereal aisle at the grocery store, because you'd go in and you have to buy a cereal, right? And there must be hundreds of cereals there, and all of them have different prices and different contents. They have different flavors, they have different weights, they have different nutritional information. Can you imagine if you went to the supermarket and you decided that you were actually going to put in the effort to select the best cereal for you? It would take you days, maybe weeks, before you could finally move on and go on to making your milk decision, which would also take you an insanely long amount of time, right? Eventually, there has to come a point where you just say, screw it, this box looks good, and you walk away, right? But when you say that, you've made a decision based on heuristics, right? You've made a stereotyped decision, and that's totally okay. You have to. Please do not spend the next 3 days trying to select a cereal. Be stereotypical and pick one just because, right? Stereotypes are generally good and useful for things like survival. They're dangerous when they do things like oversimplify social groups, right? Like when you stereotype your cereal, it's one thing. When you stereotype, like an ethnicity, that's a totally different thing. Um, Okay, so here's a recent example, right? You know that new Ghostbusters trailer that came out, and everyone hated it, which everyone should hate it. It was a terrible trailer, right? The CG on that looked terrible. Why wouldn't they use practical effects for a Ghostbusters movie? It's totally beyond me. Anyway, a bunch of people took it an extra step and made a bunch of really moronic, sexist comments concerning this new Ghostbusters trailer. Now, they were obviously perpetuating stereotypes about women in Hollywood with that. However, did you catch the director's response to it? He had something along the lines of, geek culture is home to some of the worst assholes I've ever met, right? Like, he said something directly targeted towards the people who would presumably be the biggest fans of the Ghostbusters series, right? Uh, and this is the kind of thing that you tend to see. When a stereotype is employed, people tend to respond to that with another offensive stereotype, and it goes back and forth. And then weirdly, people are amazed when things don't get better. Like, I don't. Did this director think he was going to suddenly be showered with goodwill because he made fun of the nerds who are the primary fans of the Ghostbusters series? I don't get what his end game was. I think his end game was just that he was hurt and he lashed out, and which was exactly what happened before. You know, when the people who deeply cared about the series were hurt that it didn't look as good as it should be. They lashed out too, and now you've got this miserable cycle. So don't oversimplify social groups. That's one of the ways in which stereotyping becomes dangerous. Okay, right. Second dangerous thing. Stereotypes are dangerous when they distort generalizations in a negative direction. Now, this too is a generalization, right? In general, it's better to not form negative stereotypes. You can have positive stereotypes, and they're maybe not so not so likely to cause a problem. However, I would add the caveat. Even if you're going to be using this rule of trying to avoid creating negative stereotypes, I still think that there's a danger here. So, for example, when I was a kid in the 80s and the 90s, it was very in vogue to talk about Native Americans as though they had like magical earth powers, or that they had some sort of supernatural connection with nature by virtue of their ethnicity. Now, on the one hand, that's cool, I suppose. Like, it'd be neat to be an earth mage, I guess, right? Like, that would be interesting. But still, it had the effect of making Native Americans like very other, like even kind of limiting or marginalizing their actual humanity. So I think that even positive stereotypes can have a backlash, and might end up becoming negative if they cause other people to become too much of an outgroup. So you ought to be cautious anytime you make any sort of stereotype that involves people. Okay, so we know that stereotyping isn't necessarily bad, but it can become bad very quickly. So what stereotypes do we get perpetuated on television? What does television tell us about people over and over and over again through reinforcement? What does television tell us about minorities through this repeated exposure? What does it tell us about women through this repeated exposure? What does it tell us about life in general? What does it tell us about marriage or the nature of love? What does it tell us about patriotism or authority? What does it tell us about these things? Let's start where the smart researchers start. Let's start with a content analysis. So, who is on TV? Who is in film? You might be surprised to find out, actually, in both film and TV, white people and black people are both overrepresented. That means they appear more often on screen than they do in the population of the country. Every other ethnic group except for Native Americans is underrepresented. Native Americans are pretty close to accurately represented because they're a very small portion of the population. The saddest underrepresentation is actually for Hispanics. Hispanics make up 27% of our population, but they're only 2 to 6% of TV characters, and they're only 1% of film leads, and most of that 1% is Antonio Banderas. So they're very badly underrepresented. You'd think that we have no Hispanic people living in this country if you were basing your decision off of what you saw in film. Now, just because somebody is highly represented or underrepresented doesn't actually say much about what's happening. So, for example, I said earlier that black people were overrepresented on television in contrast to the amount that the percentage that they actually represent in the population. This is partially because, for whatever reason, African Americans are more frequent cable subscribers than other ethnicities. Nobody's really sure why, but there's a lot of programming that leverages that. And then also in the news, you find that there's a gross overrepresentation of crimes that were committed by African Americans. And we're talking about double digits in the percentages of an overrepresentation as opposed to crimes committed by any other race. So just because somebody is featured prominently doesn't say much about how they're being featured, right? That's the limits of a content analysis. So when we actually start looking at the content, I would argue that the most striking finding we actually have comes from sexualization. Now, this sounds weird, but with minority groups, we find that when they're portrayed on television, the female characters are very much more likely to be highly sexualized. To me, that seems a little intuitively weird, right? And social critics have for a long time proposed a number of reasons for this. I don't favor any of their explanations, and you can ponder this on your own. I would like to add to their voice that this seems to be a historical effect, right? People throughout history have always seemed to be a little bit more comfortable with sexualizing these out groups than they have been with sexualizing the women in their own in-group. It's an odd effect, but we see it echoed now throughout our media. I was actually party to kind of an unusual experiment. I'm very interested in psychophysiological data, so I'm interested in getting as good a look at what happens to your body and brain, especially your brain, when you encounter messages. I'm very into persuasion and that sort of thing. I like to see how a person reaches into someone else's brain and tinkers around with what's in there. How do you shape the things that are going on in somebody else's head? I like that area of research. So anyway, I was part of this really strange experiment that we performed, where we showed men an image of a woman in a bikini, an attractive woman in a bikini, right? Incidentally, if you're an advertising person, that's the best way to sell a product, by the way. It's the most rapidly persuasible. We'll talk about that when we hit persuasion, I think. Anyway, we showed men this image, and there were two conditions. In the one condition, this image was Caucasian. In the other condition, we didn't change anything at all, except for skin tone, to make it considerably darker so she would appear to be African American, right? Then, when we had the guys look at it, we used eye tracking software to see the exact spots on the image where the guys were placing their eyes. And the craziest thing, for the image which was darkened, the guys lingered more on the naughty bits, and for the image that wasn't, they didn't. It was this really surprising effect to me, but the lead researcher on the project, he was not surprised at all. He didn't have a great explanation, but he figured that this was what was going to happen. So I have seen firsthand from the research that this effect bears out. It's an odd one, and maybe it's one that you'll want to consider in your future interactions with media. That's the end of the class for today. Don't forget to take your quiz. Don't forget to do your discussion video. And that should cover you for this week. Oh, but don't forget that if you haven't taken that survey yet from late last week, definitely do that as soon as possible and get that cleared off of your table. Again, I'm very, very sorry about this video being late. I will do my best to make sure it doesn't happen again. Thank you for being patient as this experimental new class takes shape, and I hope it's working out well for you guys. I want you also to know I'm very open to your feedback on this, and I'm interested in knowing how things are working for you. So if you have suggestions for how things might go better, or if you like how things are going and you just want to let me know, feel free to drop me a line at my email, and I'd be very pleased in knowing. Thank you. All right, take care, guys. I'll see you next week.